All right, today we're going to talk about ISO 27701, which is really a new certification that has come out here in 2020 to cover privacy. It's an overlay to 27001, which is a security framework and gives companies an opportunity to certify against a security framework, but also a privacy framework. I think we could kick it off with a quick introduction. So I'm the managing director here at Risk 360, focusing on our compliance practice and then also our security practice, and really helping lead our ISO implementations, which mostly consist of ISO 27001 and 27701 and also 9001, which is our quality management system. So that's me, Christian. Hi, Phil, you mind doing a quick intro?
Sure. So I'm a director here at Risk 360. I run our privacy practice, so working on compliance and program implementation, serving as outsourced DPO for several companies. I'm also a fellow of information privacy, so passionate about privacy. Excited to talk today.
The resident expert. So for people watching that don't know, Phil's the brainchild behind most of our dozens of white papers at this point on privacy. And also, fun fact, Phil, you can do large math problems in your head, which I'm always impressed with. I feel everyone needs to know that. Cool. So let's dive in here. So I guess the point of today's talk really is multifold. One, obviously, there's a privacy prism to this, so we'll talk about how ISO 27701 addresses privacy from a philosophical perspective, but really also how organizations can become certified, because a lot of times that's what the goal is. And an important thing there is how ISO 27001 and 27701 are related, because you have to really do both of those to obtain a certification. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll go into structure, implementation process, certification process, timeline, and then at the end, Phil, we'll rapid fire some questions at you to see if you can answer those. Okay. Cool. So we talked a little bit about like background already, but I think an important point for people out there who maybe are going through ISO certifications for the first time is to kind of understand the backdrop and the governance structure of all the ISO frameworks really here in the US. So if you're seeking certifications here in the US, that most of the organizations that are doing certifications are governed by an organization called ANAB. There's also one called UCAS and others, but you only need to know that because if you want to get certified, you need to be certified by an authorized certifying body. And that in here in the US is usually ANAB. That governs the rule sets of how the auditor is going to audit you. So you can go to their website, find a certifying body, make sure they're accredited. That's an important point. I think right now in the U.S., there's I think 14 or 15 authorized accreditation bodies for 27001, and I think there's only 3 or 4 that are also accredited to do 27701. So it's a pretty limited selection right now. So make sure you get that. Second thing is, if you're seeking certification, understand that to get 27701, the privacy element of the certification, you have to first get 27001 certified. So if you don't have either one of those certifications right now, just understand security and privacy are connected. So the journey is 27001 and 27701. We have another webinar that Sawyer and I did, Phil, over 27001. So it might be helpful to watch that webinar and then watch this one to kind of understand the full package. So that's kind of the ecosystem we're operating in. And then market drivers. So I think the bottom line is the driver on 27701 was GDPR ultimately. Everyone globally is getting scrutiny from business partners wanting to answer the question, how are you compliant with GDPR? Because anyone can state that they're compliant against GDPR, but ultimately people want to be able to articulate what they're doing from a privacy perspective to meet those requirements. And I think 27701 was born out of that desire to evidence compliance. And that's why I think 27701 is the only ISO framework that directly maps or includes a mapping in the framework back to another framework. So ISO 27701 maps back to GDPR. So I think that is the ecosystem that we're operating in. Phil, anything you want to add as far as important background or context before we dive in here?
Yeah, I think that when you talk about when you talk about GDPR, you one of the elements that GDPR kind of touches on, doesn't go into much detail on, is the whole idea of adequate safeguards and securing personal information. That's why I think it's really great to have ISO 27701 builds right off of 27001. So that takes care of your security safeguards right there. So it's
Yep.
a great just total package.
Yep, great point. So I think maybe diving into structure a little bit here, and I'll set this up, Phil, and then maybe you can add the specifics as the expert. But ISO, as a philosophical point, regardless or agnostic of what framework that you're working within, is based on this idea of the management system. So how is your organization going to govern the topic at hand? So for ISO 27001, the governance structure is called the Information Security Management System. Is your system of management around security. Following suit, 27701 is all about the privacy information management system. So how you plan to govern privacy. And then, quality management system, whatever you're doing has a management system. And if you're doing multiple, you may also hear this concept of the integrated management system. So Phil, one thing I think we've seen that's been very popular is the ISMS for security, the PIMS for privacy, along with a QMS, a quality management system. So that's 27001, 27701, and 9001 combined. So you'll see those things, but either way, it's all about the management system. And for a 27701, that's that green section that you see here, clause 5, the privacy information management system. That links back to clauses 4 through 10 in 27001. And we'll talk about this in a second, but it's about governance, leadership, risk assessment, your KPIs, your planning, how you're doing internal audit and continuous improvement. So if you're familiar with 27001, it's linked back to that. And we'll talk about that in detail here in a second. But that's the PIMS. And then 27701 has clauses 6 through 8, Annex A and B, Annex C through F. So Phil, could you maybe just give us the quick overview of how that framework's broken up?
Yeah, so clause 6 is building off of ISO 27001 Annex A. So the implementation guidance for that is ISO 27002. So in clause 6, you're seeing I believe it's about 25% of the 27001 controls have additional guidance specific to the protection of PII. So a lot of that's just making sure that your scope is right and you're specifically considering PII in your implementation of the ISO controls. Goes into a little more detail around like asset management, some event logging, but largely not a huge lift over 27001. Then clauses 7 and 8. Clause 7 is around controller responsibilities. Clause 8 is around processor responsibilities. So these are your controls hewing very closely to GDPR, if you want to look from that perspective, but getting down into notice, choice, consent, subject access request, privacy by design, supplier management with respect to privacy, so your sub-processors. So all of that will be covered in clauses 7 and 8.
So is it fair to say, kind of as a summary, clause 6 is just that privacy overlay to 27001 implementation, and then 7 and 8 is when you're really breaking out, am I a controller of the data or a processor of the data, and how is that applicable to me?
Got it. Exactly. So Annex A and B is just listing out those controls. So those mirror clauses 7 and 8. Then there are some mappings in the additional annexes. So there's a mapping to ISO 29100, which is around privacy. Annex D is probably the most interesting one. That's ISO's mapping to GDPR, which is pretty comprehensive. Annex E, looking at ISO 27018, which is a previous standard that's kind of getting phased out. And then Annex F is a very short example of just interpreting Clause 5, essentially.
Yeah.
So those last few are all just illustrative, you don't have to address them for certification.
Yeah, I think that's an important point because it seems like a lengthy framework if you just look at the document package, but it's separated into mandatory and non-mandatory or optional areas. And the first part of this, Clause 5, Clause 6, 7, 8, Annex A and B are mandatory if you're a processor and controller. And then C through F are all optional or just kind of informational, like you said. Cool. So maybe diving a little bit into the PIMS. So if you've never been audited over an ISO framework, I think it's surprising to know that the heart of the audit and really the heart of the framework isn't the controls themselves. We see this a lot in 27001. And also privacy, where when people think of ISO frameworks, they immediately jump to the controls, the 114 controls or the various privacy controls that are all about implementing the framework, where the heart of the audits and also the heart of the implementation is the management system itself. So it's important to cover off on that because I think probably over 50% of the audit efforts for certification and a good chunk of the implementation efforts is all about that governance structure. So PIMS here, you'll see we have the relevant clause, and then in gray there is where that maps back to the ISO 27001 ISMS clause. But just quick walkthrough, you have kind of the context of the organization. So I guess from my perspective, I like how the PIMS and ISMS is broken out because it's a good way to think about a program. So it says, hey, tie it back to the context of your organization, the internal stakeholders, external stakeholders, the business case, things like that. So you can put your program, as it says, in context of what's important for the organization. That's really what Clause 5 is about. Or Clause 5.2. Then you get into leadership. This is talking about governance, top level managements, and you'll hear this a lot. Their commitment to continuous improvement. So if top level management's not involved, that's a red flag from an ISO auditor's perspective. Then you get into planning, which is your risk assessment, your strategic roadmap, your resource planning. That's kind of the same through support. Operations, where we get into some KPIs and some, again, it refers back to risk assessment. And then Clause 5.7 and 8, it's really when you get to your measurement activities, when you're doing your annual internal audits. So you're rolling those internal audit findings up to management and then ultimately taking corrective action to build those back into your everyday processes. So that's the ecosystem of the PIMS. The heart of any ISO certification is that management system. Anything you want to highlight here? I know there's a couple nuances to the PIMS, Phil.
Yeah. So another thing I really like about this framework, relative to GDPR, GDPR establishes the DPO or Data Protection Officer. That can be a big part of your implementation of Clause 5.3. But I think to really implement a management system, you're going beyond that because you're thinking about risk assessment and really a living program. We talk about continuous improvement, and that's really, it can almost be a sea change compared to the way I think organizations kind of say they did a GDPR implementation and that was enough. When you talk about continuous improvement, you're really looking at things on an ongoing basis, adding in planning, resource management. So it really helps take your privacy program to the next level.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we try to do when we implement is, from a leadership perspective, is implement what we call the Information Risk Council, and also branded as an office of the ODPO, or Office of Data Protection Officer. So that's that cross-functional leadership group that has a good view across the organization to make decisions when it comes to policy, security, privacy, but then can have breakouts down into their departmental or product areas so it's a good mix of agility and centralization, and that usually solves that leadership problem. So think about an Information Risk Council. And then in planning, I think one of the things that always comes up is, how do I integrate privacy into a risk assessment? because you're likely doing 27001. A lot of people are very familiar with security risk assessments, but then you're supposed to tack on privacy, and what does that look like? And we've kind of talked about integrating that with something called a PIA, which is a privacy impact assessment, thinking about how your new products or services might impact the privacy of your end users or even your own employees, and then integrating those risks into your risk register or your overall risk assessment program for security and privacy. So just things to think about if you're hearing those words PIA or DPIA, which is your data protection impact assessment. Maybe those are good opportunities to integrate with your overall risk assessment. Cool. So maybe we'll dive a little bit into the implementation. So I think there's two parts to think about here if you're on your certification journey. One is implementing the program clearly, and then the second piece is certifying your program. So I'll walk us through implementation here. I know, Phil, you're going to cover off on some of the certification process. So implementation is typically done one of two ways. One, you're going to do this in-house, or you're going to engage a third party to help you implement. That's kind of where we specialize in on the implementation. And then you're going to go find an independent certifying body that would do the certification itself and be supported through that. So focusing on implementation, I think we typically break this out into 4 steps. I think it's easy to conceptualize that way. First of all, you do your scoping and planning. So all ISO frameworks are governed by a very specific scope. I like that because it gives you some flexibility to carve out sections of the business that perhaps it doesn't make sense. You can even carve out certain functions or products and only have certain products and systems certified. And there's always a good mix of corporate governance that'll be kind of global mixed with product focus. So it gives you, I think ISO in general is a right-sized approach, given that it's both flexible but comprehensive. So during scoping, that's when you'll hear terms like the statement of applicability, which is which controls are in scope. You'll hear something called the application letter, which is what you'll send to your external auditor to apply for certification. Also communication cadences, deciding if you're a processor or a controller, and which controls are applicable to you there. That's all the stuff we do during scoping and planning, and that will really impact what the scope of certification is, when you pursue that. And then we come in and we do a current state assessment. That's really just a gap assessment against the ISO 27701 framework. And we try to do that in a way where it also fulfills the internal audit requirement. So you have to measure yourself anyway. And a lot of companies are doing 60-70% of the stuff right, and there's a 30% delta. So for that 30% delta, you need to come up with a remediation plan and go about implementing that. So that's when we come to those last 2 steps. I think some of the most common steps on that remediation roadmap is developing a formal PIMS. Sometimes that's not natural to an organization to have that. Developing policies, executing a risk assessment, helping implement privacy by design. So building in privacy into the development process is a common thing. And then ultimately program implementation, where we go write the policies, we go implement the controls, we establish the governance structure, put together meeting agendas, that whole 9 yards. And then we draw a line in the sand ultimately and say, hey, look, we feel like our program's up and running and it's ready to go. Let's go get certified. And then we'll move on to that step next. But as far as implementation, Phil, anything you want to highlight here that you think is important based on your experience?
No, I think this is pretty comprehensive.
Could you talk? We glanced over it a little bit, but could you maybe just talk about like how let's say someone already has an ISMS, our approach to like overlaying PIMS and risk assessment into an existing infrastructure for if they're already doing ISO 27001?
Sure. So I think when you look at the PIMS guidance, there are going to be a few areas where you definitely want to expand your ISMS. One thing, really the first thing, is just verifying your scope, seeing how protection of PII fits into what you've built into your security management system. So it's rescoping, and then there's going to be the specific language we can help with, but then it's really making sure that we've handled the scope correctly, and then like we talked about a little bit, looking at the risk assessment and ways to make sure we're considering privacy there.
Sure.
So it's not, it,
It's not a
it's,
redo, I guess I
yeah,
would say,
yeah,
right? I think
yeah.
that's the
You've
bottom
done a
line.
lot. Yeah, if you've put a management system in place, then you're in great shape to continue on with 27701.
Yep. So I think last point, I made a note here at the bottom not to forget. So there's always this question of I'm an organization and I want to implement, privacy and get certified around that. So do I implement 27001 first and then maybe the next year do 27701, or do I do a 27001 27701 combo? And we were talking about this before the webinar, Phil, and then we were like, dang it, we're gonna have to give the consulting answer, which is that it depends. And
Absolutely.
I think the thing to consider there is resources. So if you're doing 27001, the security universe is often limited to, security personnel. There's going to be some leadership involved, engineering product teams, probably IT's involved. And maybe that's intuitive because security is something people think about a lot. But then when you think about privacy, there's often new stakeholders. So the biggest one often being legal. So you may have to bring in the legal team to think about how you're handling privacy. So the lift isn't a lot, I would say, to do them together. It's just additional stakeholders, additional considerations. So if you're already familiar with 27001 and everyone has a common ground and you feel like you're pretty mature and you already have policies, things like that, I would probably say go ahead and do a combined implementation. However, if ISO language is totally new to you, a lot of these concepts, security is new to you, privacy is also new, then in that case, I think from a sheer volume of vocabulary, it's easier to break these things up. So then maybe you do 27001 first, and then you do 27701 maybe the following year, which is a very common approach. But there's no one size fits all. It's highly dependent. So then, like I said earlier, you all right, we're in great shape. We've implemented the program. Now we have to go after certification. So Phil, could you maybe just kind of walk us through the certification process?
Sure. So once you've identified your external auditor who's going to do the certification, you're going to walk through that planning and scoping with them. Similar to implementation, just they're going to need to understand the size of your program and what they're going to be certifying. So they'll send you a formal application letter to collect that background information, because they do have standards they need to meet around like audit time, so that will help them determine what's going to be required from them. From there, you can move to stage one once everything is agreed upon. So stage one, the auditor's going to look at, it's going to be more heavy on the PIMS side, making sure that you've got the documents in place, you've started your governance structure. They'll pull out a few additional high-risk items from the remainder of the standard just to make sure that you look good. They think that you're ready to go to the full audit, which is stage two. So stage two, that will usually be on site when we're not in the midst of a pandemic. So on-site time is also determined by the standards your auditor has to meet. And this, fortunately, this looks a lot like the internal audit that we do during implementation. So it won't be the first time you're seeing the request, but the auditor is going to have extensive requests around all of your in-scope controls. They're going to look at your PIMS implementation in detail. So that's where the rubber really meets the road, and it's an intense audit, but when you've gone through implementation, you should be in good shape to handle it. So you've been through it once with us.
Yeah, typically, I think again, don't forget this is going to be in tangent with the 27001 audit. So what often happens logistically is you'll have a security auditor come out in tangent with having someone with some privacy expertise. So sometimes that'll be the same person because they know both. Sometimes it'll be one guy or girl for security and another person for privacy. So I think the one thing to highlight, I feel like this is like a 60-day minimum process. We'll talk about timeline here in just a second, but a lot of folks don't plan for that. I think they think of a 6-month or 12-month implementation, but they don't realize 60 to 90 days of that is the audit itself, because you do stage 1, then 30 days later you do stage 2, and then another 30 days that it takes to get certification. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. We talk about timeline. So thanks, Phyllis. Let's talk about timelines since we're on that. Timelines, I would say on average for an implementation and certification are somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And that's largely going to depend on the size and complexity of the organization, and also how motivated you are to become certified. If you have time to spare, I always say, hey, go for the 12-month timeline, that we can do a deep, thorough implementation. You don't have to drop everything and focus only on this. You can kind of keep your day job and make sure operations are up and running. But frankly, a lot of this is driven by a prospect or customer's requirements. They say, I will not do business with you unless you have an ISO certification. So they probably have a line in the sand when they want to see that certification happen. So we've seen those. You have 6 months to do it, and you just have to do that. That's okay. On average, we break it out like this. This is where I was talking about. If you look at the right-hand side here, don't forget about that minimum 60 days of the audit. And so let's talk through this. So kind of planning's that first month. We talk about scope. In tangent, we do our gap assessment, current state assessment. That usually takes a month. And then into the second month, we're kind of wrapping up. Then we do our remediation roadmaps. We get all of our stakeholders together. We talk about what needs to get done, when it needs to do it, who's going to do it. And then we start implementing. You're writing policies, you're rolling them out, you're getting them ratified, you're implementing security controls, you're updating your security protocols, all of that good stuff. Then you're going to do stage 1 on it, just like Phil talked about. And then there's usually a 30-day delta, 30 to 45-day really delta between stage 1 and stage 2. So you have to plan for that gap. Stage 1's like a week long or a couple days long. 30 to 45 days later, you'll do stage 2, which is a week or 2, depending on the organization's size, sometimes even longer. And then roughly 30 days later is when you're going to get your report in hand. And so don't forget to plan for that. You're going to do your stage 2 audit, but then it's like 30 to 60 days later, depending on the certifying body, before you'll actually get a certification in hand to hand off to the customer, because they have QA. They have other clients they're working on, so it takes a while to get that certification in hand. So don't forget about that right-hand side of the planning when you're planning your timeline out and making commitments with clients. Phil, anything you want to add here? I know you've been through a ton of audits, sitting on the other side of the auditor. Anything you want to add to this timeline?
No, I think you hit it.
Cool. All right, so Phil, buckle up here. We're going to start hitting you with some rapid fire. So we've compiled a handful of questions that almost everyone asks, so we wanted to make sure we built in some time to just answer those and hopefully answer questions that people watching this might have. So I'm just going to rattle them off here. So big one up front, Phil, how much does a ISO 27701 certification cost?
It's going to depend.
Yeah.
That's a simple answer. Again, we in conjunction with number 3, processor / controller, we'll work on getting your scope right, thinking about what your customers and stakeholders are interested in, because that's what you need to satisfy in the end. But we're also conscious of effort and cost, so looking at all of that together to make sure that we're taking the right approach.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, Phil, I think, and this is a little bit dependent on how complex your privacy situation is, because sometimes that's a lot more complex than others. But if you're already doing 27001, you're probably looking at a 25 to 50% cost increase over what you're already doing for 27001. That's probably a planning factor. And if you already know that your privacy situation is really complex and there's a lot of data involved, and kind of eats towards the 50% additional, and if you're pretty simple, maybe the 25% as a planning factor. Number 2, so everybody's wondering, is 27701 a GDPR certification?
No, it is not. So the EU Data Protection Board is appears to be holding strong right now, and they're not really addressing 27701 at this point. I think if you really dive deep enough, you can see where there are still some deltas, but from a market-facing perspective, I feel that it covers so much of what GDPR is going for that it
Yep.
can be very effective.
So I think we're in June 2020, and as of today, I don't think there is any GDPR certification, right? But we need the marketplace needs a mechanism to say, hey, look, here's what we're doing around privacy, and 27701, I think, arguably is the most effective method to do that right now. So it's the best we have. So how do I know if I'm a controller or a processor?
So again, I think a big portion is what your customers and stakeholders are interested in. We, in a lot of cases, we're steering companies, especially service providers, more towards processor only, because if your customers are providing you personal information of their customers or their employees, then you're probably doing some processing there that may be sensitive, so it would make sense for that to be in scope. And all you're really controlling is, say, a username/email, password, just less critical from a privacy perspective. So it depends a lot on your business model.
Yeah, maybe an important point is you may in fact be both by the letter of the law, but you don't have to get certified on both. You could, for example, just choose processor. I think it's largely dependent upon, like you said, the nature of the business. So for most of our service provider clients, they're working with controllers who own the data, handing it off to the processor and saying, I really want to know what you're doing as a processor. So that's kind of the focus. So let's take risk assessment number 4 and 5 as a whole. So so what is the difference between maybe a privacy risk assessment and a privacy impact assessment? What do those look like functionally if people are hearing words like that?
So a privacy risk assessment, there's really not a ton of guidance out there. From our perspective, I think we're looking at the potential risk and impact to the business of the data they hold and the types of processing they perform. The privacy impact assessment is really a different frame of mind, because the key phrase there is the rights and freedoms of individuals. So you're taking those same inputs, the data you hold, the processing you perform, but you're looking at it from a perspective of what could happen with this data, what could happen as a result of the processing that could affect the rights and freedoms of the individuals whose data it is.
Yep. So I'm bringing a new product to market, and maybe thinking through as a product owner, hey, am I collecting a bunch of new data on individuals, and is that going to impact my relationship with them, or no? So some of that stuff integrating. There's also this concept that we talk about of privacy by design. So as I'm building an application, I'm building in privacy. Same with security by design. All right, we're going to do number 6, and I'll bounce around a little bit. So what if I'm in the cloud, which almost everyone is, right? I'm using AWS or Google Cloud or whatever. How does that impact this?
So I think the big thing is to understand what you're responsible for with respect to your cloud provider. So you might think that something is automatically configured securely and you're covered from that perspective, but your cloud provider should be giving you the information on what you actually have to do if you're looking at your own compliance requirements. I think the main thing is just understanding, you still have a responsibility, even if the infrastructure itself is outsourced. You have things that you'll need to be responsible for that the auditor is going to look at.
Yeah, I think kind of the biggest pieces of audit artifacts, if you will, stuff you have to provide an auditor, is typically like a DPA, like a data protection addendum or data processing addendum, however you want to call that. So
Yeah.
some form of vendor management, some form of agreement with that third party saying, hey, this is what I'm providing you. We have, some agreements in place of how we're going to process that data. So make sure you're doing that. And when you're working with these huge cloud providers, most organizations have almost no leverage. You can't make them comply or do what you would like. But the good news is most of those companies are ahead of that, and they have resources available to all of us end users. For example, DPA templates and pre-written agreements that they go ahead and enable end users to comply with those requirements. I'm going to skip around a little bit here.
Okay.
So Phil, what does, this is a good question. What does an ISO 27701 certification look like? What's the piece of paper I'm going to get to hand off to clients?
Yeah, it's a little less than you might expect. It is a piece of paper. It will contain the specific scope that you provide in the application letter, and it'll say you've met the requirements of ISO 27001 and 27701.
Yep, it's literally a one pager, sometimes two if your scope's long enough, but pretty. So a lot of people have seen SOC 2s or high trust reports or others that are, hundreds of pages or 100 pages, whereas the certification truly is a pretty limited document. I guess talking a little bit about our stuff, can you talk a little bit about the resource? We have questions around, do we have policy templates, things like that? What do we have available to people if they need to get started, Phil?
Yep. So we have our PIMS template, which is really the basis for your program. We have a ODPO charter that can be used, risk management policies, policies over subject access requests. We can work on standard contractual clauses and data processing addendums. So really the whole gamut of your program and what might come up under 27701.
I think the favorite thing that we do that we get to work on is like restructuring governance structures for organizations to fit privacy in there. So like structuring an information risk council or similar, thinking about who needs to be involved, what the roles and responsibilities are, how to charter that organization, what the KPIs they should track. So that kind of stuff's really fun and is really the foundation of a great program, because there's really no two that look exactly alike, and that's kind of fun. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to stop us there. I think that's most of the big questions, and talk a little bit about if people want additional resources, if they want to access your brain for any questions, how to do that. So we have Phil Brudney, who we're speaking here. He's our director of privacy, author of a lot of our thought leadership. You have his email there if you guys want to reach out to him. Also myself, if you want to reach out to me, email there. Couple things to point back to. We have a lot of white papers on 27701, 27001, GDPR, CCPA. I think you did a state-by-state mapping of the different privacy requirements across states at one point. So if you go to our white papers page, there's a lot of free resources available to be able to kind of dissect this and think about your privacy strategy and security strategy. Similarly, we have a lot of blog posts, so you can go to our ISO category there, check out our blog posts. I think we write something almost every week. And then last kind of link there is if you are looking for an accredited certifying body, you can go to ANAB's website and they have that list, pretty short list. There's like 15 organizations that can do that. I guess I had 5 that can do 2771 or something like that. So pretty short list. White papers, access to Phil, blog post. That should get everyone started and they can reach out to us. So Phil, thank you for sharing some of your expertise with us. You're a privacy beast, so it's always great to talk to you. And thanks everybody for listening.